right. Where were we? I think when we had just left off yesterday, Scrooge's nephew had come for a visit. And Scrooge, being Scrooge, well, chased him off. And as we read, that poor fool had let a few people into the room which Scrooge would simply rather not deal with. Now, these two men are a bit of a standard that you'll see anywhere these days, especially. Most now modern stand at red bells and bowls and ringing outside of stores and asking for you to drop in a bit of coin. But in days of this, there were those that would go around to the businesses, as there still are today, to ask for something of a little more significance. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago, this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been two kindred spirits at the ominous word liberality. Scrooge frowned, shook his head, handed the credentials back. "And this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "Well, they are still," returned the other gentleman. I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law? On full vigor, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, well, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it." "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink, and a means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt, and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Oh, you wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone." "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost me enough, and those who are badly off must go there." "Well, many can't go there, and many would rather die." "Well, if they would rather die," said Scrooge, "then they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." "Oh, but you might know it," observed the gentleman. "It is not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual of him. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickened, so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in the frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in the brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands, winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowing suddenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where the holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should. Even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. The good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapon, and indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol, but at the first sound of "God bless ye, merry gentlemen, may none of you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At the length, the hour of shutting up at the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted that fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used, when I pay a day's wages for no work?" When the clerk observed it was only once a year, a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning," said Scrooge, buttoning his great coat to the chin. The clerk promised he would. Scrooge walked out with a growl, and the office was closed in a twinkling. And the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter hanging below his waist, for he boasted no great coat, went down the slide on Cornhill at the end of the lane of boys 20 times, in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could to play at blind man's bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and, having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's books, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile-up building or yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying that it must have run there when it was a young house, playing hide-and-seek with other houses and then forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost hung so thick about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place, and also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation alderman. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without it undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as like other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge, as Marley used to look. With its ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead, the hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid color, made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part of its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue, but he put his hand upon the key he relinquished, turned it sturdily, and walked in, lighting his candle. He did pause, with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out of the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Pooh-pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room, every cask in the wine merchant's cellar below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes all its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door, walked across the hall, and up the stairs, slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. Now, you may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs or through a bad young act of Parliament, but I mean to say you have got a hearse up that staircase and taken it broadwise, with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. There was plenty of width for that and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out in the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room. All as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. Small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head, used as the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, and nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Old fire guard, old shoes. 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed the door, locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the last sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba's, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abraham's, Belshazzar's, apostles putting off to sea in butterboats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. Yet that face of Marley's, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod, and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been blank at first, with power to shape some picture from its surface, from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of Marley's head on every one. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again, and threw his head back in the chair. His glance happened to rest upon a bell. A disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, the bell began to swing. It swung so softly in the outset and it scarcely made a sound beyond a text alert. But soon, it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted half a minute, or a minute ahead, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. Well, the cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. It's humbug still. I won't believe it. His color changed, though, when without pause it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" and fell again. The same face. The very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, tassels on the ladder bristling like his pigtail, his coat skirts, the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped at about the middle. It was long, wound about him like a tail. And it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, looking through his waistcoat, could see the two buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now. Though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, he felt the cold, chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of a folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not yet observed before. He was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, as caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much!" Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?"
Ask me who I was.
"Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as much more appropriate.
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
"Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him.
I can.
"Well, do it, then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in condition to take a chair, and felt that the event of being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down, opposite the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it.
You don't believe in me,
said the ghost. "Well, I don't," said Scrooge.
What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?
I don't know, said Scrooge.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Well, because, said Scrooge, a little thing affects them. Slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be a bit of undigested beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave to you, whatever you are. Scrooge was not in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. Well, the truth is, he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention, and keeping down his terror, for the specter's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play Scrooge felt the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the specter's being provided with an infernal atmosphere. Scrooge could not feel it in himself. It was perfectly clear this was the case. But though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair skirt, its tassels were agitated as if by hot vapor from an oven. You see this toothpick? Said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the visage's stony gaze from itself.
I do,
replied the ghost. You are not looking at it.
but I see it notwithstanding.
Well, I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug! At this the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, and its lower jaw dropped upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. Mercy, he said, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not? I do. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes forth not in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness.
Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why.
I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link, yard by yard. I girded it on my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as full and heavy as this, and as long 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain.
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Jacob, he said imploringly. Oh, Jacob Marley, please, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would not. A very little more is permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in my life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me.
It was a habit with Scrooge whenever he became thoughtful to put his hands inside his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost said, he did so now, but without lifting his eyes or getting off his knees. You must have been very slow about it, Jacob, Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference.
Slow?
Well, 7 years dead, and traveling all the time.
The whole time, no rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse.
You travel fast?
On the wings of the wind.
But he might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years. The ghost, upon hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance.
Oh, captive bound in double iron, not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which is susceptible to all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunity missed. Yet such was I, oh, such was I.
But you were always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself.
Business! Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business.
It held up a chain at an arm's length, as if that were all the cause of its unveiling grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. At this time of the rolling year, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to the poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly.
Hear me, my time is nearly gone.
I will, said Scrooge. But don't be too hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray.
How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see I may not tell? I have sat invisible beside you many a day.
It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow.
That is no light on my penance. I am here tonight to warn you that you have a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer.
You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank ye.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghosts had done. Is that the chance you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice.
It is.
I think I'd rather not.
Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first one tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1.
Well, couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge.
Expect the second one the next night at the same hour. The third one the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. And look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us.
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table, bound it round its head as it had before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude with its chains wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer, and Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out into the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in their restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost, and some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they had sought to interfere, for good in human matters had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being from emotion had undergone or the fatigues of the day, or the glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation with the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. End of chapter 1.